Hello, I'm Liz Van Acker from the School of Government and International Relations, and I'm here to talk about the US presidential elections, issues in perspective. So with me today I have Dr Tracey Arklay, my friends and colleagues from the school, and Tracey does a lot of work on voter ID. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on talking about voter ID and that issue in the American election at the moment. So Tracey, for the first question, what are the differences, do you think, between the Australian and the USA processes of casting a vote? They're very complicated.
They're very complicated, and we could talk for hours about that, so I won't bore you all with it. But there are significant differences between the electoral processes and methods used in America as compared to Australia. One of the classic ones that for me is really obvious is that here in Australia we have independent electoral officials. These are public servants who are non-partisan officials who monitor and regulate and overview elections. In America, often the people that overview the elections are elected officials, they're partisan officials. So, that raises interesting questions for me that I won't go into. I'll let people make their own determination about that. But, for a country that claims to be the world's biggest and best democracy, I think it's interesting that their electoral process can be, potentially tarnished in such a way. And if you remember back, and people that are old enough will remember back to Florida in 2000 and how the then president candidates, Al Gore, narrowly lost that election because of the Florida officials who were elected officials actually saying that they couldn't do a recount on, the voting papers that were, because of the way that they vote. They don't vote consistently across different states. So some people, tick boxes like we do here. Other states, they have these machines that you press out. And in that case, there was all this, ludicrous, stuff about pregnant, dimpled, and hanging chads. And so those sorts of processes, you wouldn't see that happen here in Australia. We've got a real routinized process that prevents that kind of, partisan activity and actions around elections. And once again, you can see, and this is Florida again, after Cyclone Matthews just recently hit, and the governor there, who happens to be on Trump's, I think he's managing his super PAC, actually ruled out that even despite the fact that there were significant delays because of Hurricane Matthews, that citizens he wasn't going to increase registration times. And Hillary Clinton had asked for that to happen, but he determined, and he alone could determine that that wasn't going to be allowed. And it's been interesting because Florida is a significant swing state, and at the moment 400,000 approximate Democrat voters have registered there, and the count currently is 60,000 Republicans have registered. So you can see why they might be worried there, and there might be a political dimension there. So that's the first thing, that kind of consistency, that kind of partisan versus, non-partisan officials. Compulsory voting. We have compulsory voting here. Of course, the US operates on voluntary voting, and I'll put my hand up straight away. I'm a supporter of compulsory voting. I understand that some people complain about it, but one thing about compulsory voting is that in Australia we have around 90% of people actually turning up to vote at each election. In American presidential elections, that's about 60% of eligible voters who turn out to vote, and of course that can depend on things like the weather. And I think it's going to be really interesting this time around because this election has polarised a lot of people. And whether or not people decide they can't possibly vote for Trump because he's so deplorable, but they can't also vote for Hillary because they don't like her, so they just don't bother to turn up, which is, a potential real limitation to their system of democracy, I would argue. Compulsory voting gives people around Australia, what it means is that officials have to make sure people have access to be able to vote. So we have, a tremendous system in place where we have mobile voting booths, postal voting, pre-poll voting, which of course they do have pre-poll voting too in the states, but it differs from state to state depending on the rules of those states. So there's no consistency there, which I think is incredibly different to here. voluntary voting is also means that there's a lot of money spent in getting people to actually vote in the
Just
first
come out and
place.
vote.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, you have all these getting out the vote campaigns, and you have allegations of, cars that were driving people to the polling booth tyres being slashed and things like that. Issues when the bad weather hits, when they turn up.
They're queuing for hours.
Absolutely.
Terrible. Yes,
Absolutely. And also, and I don't know if people are aware of this, but in America you vote on a Tuesday, not a Saturday. And, the obvious advantage of voting on Saturday for us Australians is quite clear. Most people have Saturdays off and can get time, to vote. If they're working Saturdays, they can do pre-poll voting. In the States, and this is an antiquated, rationale for having Tuesday votings, and it's to do with in the 1800s, America was an agrarian society, and so it used to take people on horse and buggy, about a day to get into towns often. So I think Thursday were market days, so they would allow people to come in to vote in the townships on Tuesday, return home for market on the Thursday, and be home for the Sabbath on the Sunday. These sorts of rationales still hold over, even though it makes no sense today. And of course, as well, when you consider that a lot of poor people get paid hourly rates, they don't get time off, paid leave to go vote on a Tuesday. So that's another disincentive, along with voluntary voting, to make it a little bit more hard for some people to actually vote, and could actually, dissuade people from voting. So that's the significant differences, I think, between Australia and the USA.
Okay. Well, Queenslanders toyed with voter ID a couple of elections ago amid a lot of controversy, wasn't there? And then the new government removed that idea and that practice. Voter ID also exists in the USA, though. Are the arguments around voter ID similar? What's going on there? Why is that an issue?
Yeah, Liz, the arguments around voter ID are very similar to what Newman pushed here, and it was to eliminate so-called voter fraud. Now, there's been extensive studies, there's a lot of scholarly literature about this fact that voter fraud really isn't a huge problem.
These dead people are not all voting.
No, that's exactly right. Dead people don't vote, and most people don't go and vote more than once on purpose. In Australia, for example, it's been found by the Electoral Commission when they've looked into it that a lot of the cases of multiple voting are actually elderly people who might have done a postal vote.
Right.
And then their relatives come on a Saturday, take them out to vote. Come on, Mum, we're taking them out to vote.
Let's go.
And they've forgotten that they did a postal vote.
Yes, sure.
But we have ways of determining that. The Electoral Commission looks into that after each election and tracks down the people and asks them the questions. In fact, the majority of cases are mistakes being made when people cross off the roll when they go to vote. So it's electoral, mistakes and errors that occur. No voter fraud has ever actually made an election, has actually altered the outcome of an election, and that's true, I think, in America. But in the States, voter ID is much more of a difficult proposition than it is here. In Queensland, when they introduced it for one election, one by-election, we had very generous ID laws, even though I thought it was unnecessary and a waste of time and things. What you could bring as a form of ID was quite generous. In the States, some states have similar kind of generous proposals. They can bring a bill, for example, or some kind of identifying information. But some states that tend to be Republican introduce really harsh voter ID laws, sometimes requiring particular photos to be taken by, electoral officers or the motor vehicle registration that actually is their voter ID record. They don't allow student IDs and things like that. Right. So this makes it very difficult for people often to get in and actually have that photo taken. Sometimes there's costs involved in actually travelling in, and those offices are only open Monday to Friday, and they often shut 2 hours at lunchtime. Again, making that particularly difficult. In 2013, there was a court case that ruled that the federal court could no longer listen to appeal cases about voter ID. And since that time, the number of states that have imposed voter ID has increased from 14 to 32 currently. And around 16 of those are particularly tough, have particularly tough ID requirements. If I say some of the states, Georgia, Ohio, Mississippi, these are Republican states that require, special ID. And you know, still you hear, despite this, you hear people like Donald Trump actually arguing that, you know, the election's going to be easily
Yes,
rigged over there.
absolutely.
North Carolina recently had their voter ID proposals dismissed by their court, because it was found to have a racially discriminatory effect. And Clinton actually particularly used that case and said, you know, people will be going out and voting for Hillary Clinton 15 times, you know, making, I think, or seeding the doubt that if he loses, you know, the election's been rigged, which I think is now, as he's decreasing in the polls, he's setting up that kind of, you know, debate to occur afterwards. And quite scary stuff's happening where you hear some people going, if Hillary wins, you know, we could have a revolution.
Yes.
Or
I did hear that.
Or even worse, just absolutely terrible stuff. Yeah.
Okay, and finally, do you think that voter identity does influence elections? And if so, how?
What voter ID did in Queensland, and also what it's supposed to do in the States, is stop people impersonating other people when they turn up to vote. Of course, voter ID is useless for postal voting, things like that. So, you know, it doesn't actually stop people fraudulently voting if they really wanted to do so. You know, afterwards, you know, that can be investigated, and those people found. And in the US, there's heavy penalties for doing that on purpose. So, you know, and as I said, the evidence is in that not many cases of that exist in the first place. Whether ID actually has influenced elections, certainly didn't in Queensland, and I don't think it has in the States. But what I do know is we've had a former political director of the Republican Party in Texas actually admitting that photo ID causes a significant drop-off in legitimate democratic voting. So, because we know the people that are mainly impacted by tough ID requirements are the poor, Hispanics, black voters. And so those people are the ones likely to be disenfranchised, and they tend to more often vote the Democrat Party. And according to this political director, he said that it adds up to 3% to the Republican vote by preventing, you know, potential and eligible Democratic voters from casting a vote because of these requirements. So I think, look, what you can actually say is because of its impact on those poorer people in society, black people, Hispanic voters and things, what it does, and voluntary voting combined, means that it allows governments to potentially ignore certain groups of people, potentially large blocks of people in their policy deliberations. And I think, you know, all of us who care about democracy care about the fact that, you know, what the role of government is to actually, you know, do the best they can for all the citizenry. Voter ID presents a worry and is a concern about that.
Well, there are lots of other things to worry about in this election, and this series of talks that we're doing will discuss some of those. So thank you very much, Tracey.
Thank you, Liz.
And thank you.